Now, hello, and welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith featuring Helen Macdonald, author of Vesper Flights, and Lisa Wells, author of Believers, Making a Life at the End of the World. Pardon me. My name is Alex Schaffner, and I'm the events director at Brookline Booksmith. We're in Brookline, Massachusetts. Whether or not you're familiar with our store, I just want to say thank you so much for being part of our community this evening. And thank you especially to those of you who have already purchased a book from us or who plan to do so. We're only able to put on programming like this because of your book purchases and support. And we appreciate so much your support of us, an independent bookstore, as well as incredible authors like Lisa and Helen. Now tonight, it's my privilege to welcome two authors who operate at perhaps my favorite juncture of genres, memoir and nature writing. The nature memoir for me occupies a shelf or two in my home library. And I think what's so fascinating about it to me is that it consists of such cherishable things that don't always mesh the way they would in an ideal world. The inner life of a person is something to relish, and the wilderness of our world is something to sink ourselves into whenever we can. And a nature memoir, if you'll accept that designation, steps very intimately inside the notion that humanity and nature are separate entities. And it sort of pulls us deeper into the wild, where we and the wild are part of one another. And it interrogates the consequences of the places where we're different, where we've pitted ourselves against nature and where we've also pitted nature against ourselves. So today we're going to discuss two of my favorite books of the past year or so, not just in this genre, but favorites full stop. Lisa Wells's Believers, Making a Life at the End of the World, is absolutely remarkable. We were talking about this before. It's just, I have not really read any other books quite like this. Lisa herself is a lifelong seeker of any sort of possible balance between being human and abstaining from the war that we sometimes wage against the natural world. In Believers, she hurls you into the arms of people who reject what we may treat as guaranteed comfort or progress or a good life, and she tears down the shades between us and disaster outside. She plunges us into the sense and depths and wildness of our planet and takes us to meet people who don't live what we call normal lives because they see so clearly that normal life is not permanent or ethical or salvageable. There is so much ferocity in this book, and its blend of humanitarian, ecological, and poetic impulses is really unlike anything that I've read. In Vesper Flights, Helen Macdonald's deft handling of heavy matters, which propelled her to fame in H's for Hawk, returns in her collected essays. Here, the breathtaking flights of birds, the muscular reality of beasts, the unforgiving hardness of human constructs and human ideas all rush and graze and collide against each other. This book revels in small creatures, in life and in joy, and it celebrates moments in which we can see the world free of our own noise, the moments in which we belong within the world and not only the concrete parallel universe that we have laid over it. It also jars us with death and threat and the troubling, not at all distant realities of an insatiable human epoch. So it's my pleasure to introduce two phenomenal writers and to spend an evening with their work. Lisa and Helen, welcome.
Hi.
Thank you. That was a great intro.
Well, you've written two really wonderful books. And I've obviously said a little bit about what I think they are about, but I would love it if both of you would share sort of what you feel that the books are about and what you set out to do with them. Helen, if you want to start.
Yeah, it's I use an analogy early on in the introduction, and I described the book as a sort of a Wunderkammer, a cabinet of wonders. There are these great kind of early modern proto museums that used to hang out in big houses back in the day. And they were basically cabinets full of objects which weren't arranged according to the museological categorizations that we use today. So you had kind of, natural objects, feathers, shells, corals, fossils, along with kind of what I guess would have been described as kind of anthropological artifacts, art, and the point of them was that you could actually handle these objects, pick them up, and then you could sort of compare them, put them into close conjunction, even though these objects are very different. And get a sort of sense of wonder and attention from looking at them. And I wanted the book to really be like this. I wanted it to be about love. And of course, because we are living in the times we're living in, grief, and about the primacy of attention, of the importance of paying attention to what's there. So basically it's meant to be a cabinet of wonders. That's what it's trying to do.
Shall I
Yes.
jump in here?
Absolutely, please
Thanks,
do.
Helen. It is a cabinet of wonders. So one of the threads in Believers is about having kind of this early awakening in my teen years about what felt like the end of the world or the collapse of civilization, both as an inevitability and something that is probably necessary should any other living beings survive, which I have a somewhat more nuanced view on now and get to in the book. But, you know, as an idealistic kid, I reached this kind of catastrophic impasse in the sense that whatever solutions were kind of invited by various thinkers and you know, solutions I was encountering in the environment, which could be summarized as like run away to the woods and hide and prepare for the sky to fall, or you know, tear the system down in some kind of, you know, violent way, just weren't like possible for me. And so I set it down and you know, I don't know if you want to call it numbing, but sort of shut off to the question because it was so overwhelming to me, and turned toward writing. And that was a huge gift. But one of the ways I think about the book was, you know, these questions resurfaced later in life in my 30s. And I was encountering the same old overwhelm. And I thought, well, what would it be like to take, you know, these internal resources that I have now and bring them to bear on the question again, and just kind of see what's happened in the last 20 years since I dropped the issue, and who can I talk to, and what do they have to share. So in that way, it's very much a pilgrimage. I'm like picking the question back up and bringing it to the world.
That's really interesting. And I think if you read the book, you'll see some of those early questions and how it gets linked so beautifully to a lot of the people that Lisa meets and describes in the rest of the book. And I think one of the powerful things about the book is actually that you're not talking about people who are different from yourself in any meaningful way. Like you're saying, you're approaching them as somebody else who has sought an outside way to exist with nature. And not as something that's like not an alien idea to you, which I think is really is part of what makes the book valuable. I think you've sort of mentioned already the big scary thing about any kind of nature writing in this moment, which is that climate change and crisis is unavoidable and is very, very difficult to look at head on. But it's sort of endemic to any nature writing at this point. Are you able to find joy in nature writing despite that? Does the illness make it more difficult or even impossible?
I'm going to jump in. One of the things that was kind of lovely to find in your book was that you know, that question of the etymology of the word apocalypse. I guess, you know, that's that sense that the root means an unveiling of things that were always there but were previously hidden from our sight. So Vesper Flights is a more political book, I think, than my previous book, and it's a question that I kept coming up against when I was writing it. And so one of the things the book tries to do over and over again is to try and uncover the ways in which our society basically we project human beings into the natural world, and the ways we value some landscapes and creatures in different ways to others. You know, some things are considered to be more valuable than others. And I guess that the part of the joy of this book was simply trying to kind of puzzle out some of those ascriptions and some of those inflections that we give the natural world. And there's a kind of intellectual joy in that, just trying to figure things out. And a kind of that kind of unveiling. You know, I always think of that Baudelaire quote about, you know, the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince us he didn't exist. And I just think that the way we use nature is basically like that. We're taught that it's the one place free of human meaning, and it's the place that we hide all our deepest and most kind of crucial human meanings, because then we can see them there and use them to prove the veracity of those meanings back to us. So just the sort of joy, the intellectual joy of pulling those meanings apart was huge for me. But there's also a joy of just sort of setting down, you know, experience and consequence and encounters. And, you know, one of the things about, Lisa, your book, you know, that gave me enormous joy was this sort of sense of how peopled it is. Mine isn't peopled in the same way, but I hope that, you know, it is a kind of co-production of sort of nature and human life courses all the way through it. And the themes that run through it too, that gave me a lot of pleasure, were kind of quite complicated pleasure, were about things like borders and home and hope, things about belonging, and, you know, the ways that we confuse nature and nation. So there's lots and lots of ways in which the book is sort of gives me joy, both intellectually and emotionally, to try and do that. But it's complicated. It's a complicated thing to write about now.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is you talk about my book being peopled, and I think in many ways, I won't even call it compensatory. That just happens to be what I'm maybe best at, is being with people and writing about people. And one of the things that I always admire and envy in your books, Helen, is the, because I actually find writing about the natural world very difficult in any way that doesn't, it's very hard to capture the lived reality for me. Of being in relationship with various landscapes, and not just sort of applying these deadening, you know, proper names or, you know, associations, like expected associations. And one of the things that I really admire about all your books, but, you know, in Vesper Flights especially, is this sense of it's almost painterly the way you build through description these layers of landscape, such that we end up inhabiting them, but it's never beat you over the head with it. And in that way, when the meadow goes under the plow, we feel the loss as our own, because we've actually been living in that space throughout the essay. And to me, that's, I mean, I tend to think the most effective political arguments are, sure, like maybe overarching, you know, for a paragraph, but ultimately are rooted and anchored to the particular. And that was something I struggled with technically, actually, the whole time, as I felt like if you're going to sit down to this thing every day for years on end, then you'd better honor those spaces that nurtured you and that are lost. And I mean, I tried. I don't know if I did.
It's hard to write about loss. I mean, you know, I just think that sort of sense of bearing witness, you know, and obviously that's something that we're all dealing with. That, you know, that in Britain, you know, there's a sort of whole cohort of nature writers who are my age or a little bit older, and, you know, I was born in 1970, and we've lost, you know, 75% of our insects since then. You know, we've lost 420 million birds from Europe, so it's really hard not to write and sense that it's an elegy. You know, it's very, very hard to do that. And one of the things that I loved about your book is that sort of really fierce sense of you know, the way that you pleated together your own really nuanced and complex coming to terms and working out where you stand, in the sense of that it's you know, there's no single way to deal with this, that it's a sort of multiplicity of ways of dealing with the situation we are now, and the multiple ways in which different people's own kind of spiritual and social backgrounds kind of conflict the ways in which they deal with sort of rewilding and making home in this damaged place. It's just intensely moving in a way that made me feel that I knew these people, you know. And I think I'm quite a introvert, you know. I've basically my lockdown life has been almost unchanged. So, like, you know, it was actually just a joy to sort of read of all these different, you know, manifold ways of engaging with the place that we're now in. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I mean, I feel you know, similarly, there's a kind of ratty field in my book that was a formative place for me, and walking around my neighborhood, listening to you read the audio of that meadow. It was almost like I just felt a little bit twinned. Yeah.
The meadow is a really strange place. I mean, that was a real realization for me, Lisa. It was that sense that, the moment when, I had always had this deeply moralized kind of sense that people were just like messing stuff up and screwing stuff up, and the notion that they're just trying to make the world the way they think it ought to look, and burning great bits of it down. And it came to me really late. I was in my 40s before I realized that. So yeah, your book courses with that realization. Sorry, wittering on here.
Very good. That's what we're here for. Oh man, I have like 5 questions, all of which I want to ask on the tail of those answers. I think what I would start with is, I think both of your books are a really interesting and difficult balance, as you're saying, between the political and the personal and the natural. And I'm wondering if you had sort of one of those impulses and one of those obsessions first and earliest, and the others sort of dovetailed into it, or whether it all sort of landed for you at the same time, and sort of when that happened and why this is important to you. Tiny question.
Yeah. I think for me, it always begins with the encounter, and I don't have much, and I don't know if I'm quite answering your question, but for me, it's like capturing the person, really, and then their worldview. That package kind of, that becomes the political layer, I guess. Whether it's the doctrine that they're espousing, or kind of the critical voices from the margins pushing back on the doctrine that they're espousing. So as that, but I'm actually very credulous and trusting. I'm kind of the believer is how I describe myself. So when I'm with people interviewing them, I'm not like, and then silently judging. It's like, it really takes me some time to kind of unpack and complicate the story. Yeah, so that critical apparatus kind of powers on later. And then the personal aspect to me, well, one, it's just a taste thing. Like, I'm more interested in work that can kind of toggle between these different modes. But also, I think for me, it's important to ask, like, what, it sort of keeps me coming back to the work. Like, what, what's in it for you? Like, how get your skin in the game, basically. Like, how can you make this, how can you root this to your actual experience, if you can? And that it was a truly educational process. I hadn't given much thought to that early fundamentalism and, what was motivating it. And it turns out all kinds of things, including the surface story I was telling at the time. That was true. And also a lot of unmetabolized trauma and overwhelm, and which always forces us into these rigid ways of black and white thinking. Yeah.
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 Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of small me in this book. Anyone who's read The Ages before will know me as a kind of very miserable, grief-stricken 30-something. But there's a lot of very small, eccentric, quirky me in this book. And growing up in this environment where I kind of ran pretty much feral in this bizarre, storybook landscape of a kind of faded country estate, like something out of a Victorian kids book. I wasn't as posh as those kids were in those books. And running wild and catching snakes and climbing trees, and basically, like, the kinds of things that were going on there were really interesting to me to think about now. We so often think of nature as something that, I use nature in a really loose sense, but it's something that we define ourselves against, or, test ourselves against. And this was a little kid wandering around. I wanted to make friends, so I learned all my insects from the field guides because I wanted to know their names, just like I wanted to know my friends' names at school. I mean, it was really naive sort of way of thinking about the world. Like, these insects weren't that keen on hanging out with me, but I wanted to catch them all and check them out. So I think for me, the personal is really important, partly because it's an anchor for the reader. But also because of the really classic sort of, anthropologist sort of tactic of just being reflexive, right? You don't know my biases. I need to put myself in there so you can judge why I'm thinking the things that I'm thinking and feeling the things I'm feeling. And that's a really important way for a reader, I think, to navigate what's in the text, any kind of analytical stuff. But also, I went to university, I did an English degree, and then I did this sort of history of science degree, and I got really interested. I read this one book when I was this baby historian of science, and it was William Cronin's Uncommon Ground, and it just blew my mind. It was like, oh my God. And it's a book basically about how, nature is deeply political, and it was where I first encountered this question of what wilderness is, and how wilderness isn't this kind of completely kind of smooth, seamless, fact. It's this complicated, human created notion, and how they, stuff like how ecologists have sort of they think of themselves as sort of virtual time travelers, and the way that time and memory are sort of pleated up in it. And it was just completely astonished me. So I think, the ways in which the personal and the political and all those different ways kind of interact in the book, the analytical framework is really, really academic. It's a way of thinking about the natural world that I learned first when I was doing an English degree, looking at books, realizing that books aren't just, they're just not stories and poems, that they are, in a really crass sense, that they're reflections of the society in which they were made. And I think nature is always that too. And I wanted to just make that text, sorry. I'm getting a real sense that trying to kind of pleat those things together is the work of the book. But I quite like also to really try and be honest with the reader about when I don't know stuff. I think this notion of gatekeeping expertise is so important with nature writing, but as everyone who's grown up reading nature books knows that voice, right? The voice of the objective expert, that sense that there's someone pointing to a plant and saying, aren't you lucky to have me to explain this to you? And I really felt that I needed to, no matter what else I was saying, I needed to be really vulnerable with the reader and say, quite often I haven't got a clue what I'm talking about. So those are the ways that I kind of juggle it all. Yeah, what I try and do.
So usually I'm like right on the next question, but every time somebody finishes speaking, I just sort of want to revel in everything that has just happened before it.
I tail off a bit of trouble there. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's wonderful.
Good springboard.
I think talking a bit about like you were saying the way that people sort of build themselves against nature, and I think that you both approach that topic in slightly different ways. But I think what both of you are speaking to is the way that what we think of as like civilization is as unaffected by nature as we can be, as controlling of nature as we can be. Like if we want to be cool, we're cool. If we want to be warm, we're warm. If we want to eat, the food is ready. And do you find that bridging that gap for readers is difficult? Like do they want to actively step more into a place of wildness, or is that sort of hard to convince people of?
That's a really good question. And I think the pandemic has shifted the way I think about that a bit. So this is one of the things I bang on about quite a lot, actually. And it was one of those things, I think early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of talk, and I'm sure, Lisa, you probably heard this too. It was like, oh, you can go out into the natural world and wander the forests and hills and get solace, and it's safe, and it's you can heal yourself from all this sort of imposition and be safe in the wild. And I just kept thinking, what if you live in a urban environment and you have limited financial capital? These things are not available to you. So I started thinking a lot about how one can have contact with the natural world in a way that is available to one and anyone. And I got really obsessed with the spiders in my kitchen. I'm a terrible housekeeper. There's a Fulcus spider. She's actually what they're now. She just has a whole hatch of little tiny baby spiders over my oven. Sorry, anyone who's
Sure.
Yeah. But I remember sitting and looking at these spiders and thinking, you can, we have got this sense that we have this seamless world of kind of plate glass around us in the natural world. We don't let things in. It's all not, we shouldn't touch it, but it comes in. And, sitting there looking at this spider, trying to work out what this house is like for that spider, the fact that it's the spider's house as much as mine, that the spider's phenomenal world is very different from my world. What does the spider need? Just those kind of thoughts about difference and about otherness were deeply, deeply important to me during lockdown. Not just spiders, pigeons outside, really common creatures that shared this habitat with me. So that for me was a really important moment. It was that we have this fiction that we live in this, and of course it's true, but we live in this completely insulated world, but it's not, there's just stuff everywhere. To pay attention to it is, I think, important. There's lessons in kind of empathy there that are really very useful in terms of, again, encountering and learning to love difference. So that was a big deal for me.
Yeah, and the quality of attention that you're bringing to that spider, it's like training, it's like, I don't know, meditating in all kinds of weather, and, with in all states of being, because you then take that out into the, I mean, we say natural world. I don't really, like, less and less the separation holds for me. Now, I think when you talk about like functioning ecosystems, that can be like one way of thinking about the natural world. Yeah, I guess I just don't think the separation holds, and that's something I've come to feel strongly about as through the writing of the book. I didn't really start out with that feeling, and I'm open to change, but I haven't had much feedback from readers yet, because the book just came out, and I don't have previous books about the wild, so I don't know how they're affected by it yet. But I can tell you that I was sort of writing toward not necessarily the people that I was in wilderness survival school with, or folks who are already inclined to solitude or community in the wilderness, and I wasn't necessarily writing an impassioned plea toward the bad guy or the people who are like wasting the world. I think what I really wanted to appeal to an aspect of myself that I sometimes see reflected in the external world. And that is the person for whom there's like guilt around, not being connected enough. People who are sort of crushed by the theoreticals because they don't have a lived and embodied relationship with the world that's, not even outside their door, but, nesting above their oven. And part of the reason that folks feel so estranged or sort of shut out from nature is because there's this great tradition of nature writing that is like, treats the natural world as like a cathedral that you kind of enter to be purified and then you leave, right? So it's not really based in day-to-day relationships, or you have to like suffer and sleep rough, and I just think that there's like those ways of life are great, but there's a million other options in between, and maybe one way to form a deeper relationship with the natural world is to find a way to people it. Yeah, like find a place in it, where your presence is important and there's a kind of reciprocal communication happening.
I think something that's really interesting in the way that both of you approach the ways that people sort of relate to the non-human natural world, that I sort of designated in my head as one group doing one thing, one group doing the other. Helen talks a lot about the ways that people, especially in the UK, because that's the focus of a lot of the book, sort of personify and give meaning and metaphor to individual animals and sort of imbue a human value upon the animal, and therefore it becomes precious to them. And I sort of get the feeling on the other end, from a lot of the people that you talk to, Lisa, that they are trying to shape themselves to nature. So whatever sort of background they have, they're trying to apply it in this sort of raw and new way to what can I do to be a human that fits into the natural sphere, which is not really a question, but it does seem to me that like no matter what direction you're coming at, even though we've created this line between ourselves and nature, people are really hungry to be in the world that they're meant to be a part of. I don't know if you find that to be true in one form or another of most people.
I think people are hungry.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, of course, my bias is that if they could find a place, a purpose really in serving that which gives them life, that life would get better. Yeah. But I think there are so many kind of like brilliantly engineered machines that fill the gap, that that's like, I mean, without getting too woo-woo, I just think that where you put your focus is how you worship, even if you're not a spiritually inclined person. So if most of your daily energy is sort of fixed on this form of this light show, then it's going to produce a certain outcome. And when you kind of recalibrate yourself to the other kind of like sentient rhythms, that also affects the outcome of how you feel, and the metaphors you use to describe your life and your world. So so yeah, I mean, so it's my bias to feel that like some of that insatiable hunger would be kind of tamed if something more substantive were the meal.
That's really, really, really great answer. And I think mine could be a little bit more stumbling, because I'm British, a lot of my stuff is about class. And I'm really interested in the notion that, the question really of not just how to live, but who gets to ask questions of nature, who gets to define which questions we ask of the natural world and what they are. And, there's so much power and privilege tied up with that. And I think that kind of hunger to interact with the natural world in this country in particular is so tied up with class and power. I mean, it is everywhere, but really, I mean, the natural history tradition in Britain is very much a kind of 19th century amateur leisured boys club, really. And so I think, one of the things that I'm increasingly, fierce about is that, nature is an extremely various thing, and so are the practices that take us to it, and so are the things that we, the ways we interact with it. And I'm just really delighted that, the ways that we're writing about nature now, they're being delimited. There are more kind of queer voices, there are more kind of people of color writing, there are more Black writers, there's more women. Like it just, we need more and more and more of that. So I just see my own work as just one little tiny, sort of snapshot shot in the corner of something really exciting that's happening, which is, like Lisa's book, it's really kind of this kind of huge quilt of multiple ways of thinking about what it means to exist or feel at home in a landscape that you've been told repeatedly does not belong to you. I think it's a really important question. I have got, friends in Australia who came to live in Britain and said, it's really weird to be in Britain because the countryside seems like you're allowed to be in it. Whereas in Australia, it's, and particularly you're constantly, you believe, that it is not yours, which is, and again, rightly so, it's not, so I think that question of, there's no way that writing about the natural world and feeling at home can be anything other than deeply political now. And I'm really pleased that that's becoming a much more commonplace understanding in terms of the ways that we write about it. Yeah.
You were saying how much of a greater diversity of nature writing there is now. I wonder if there are a couple of sort of current authors that you would particularly recommend to people who like both of your books.
Oh, so many. Lisa, do you have anything? I feel I'm talking too much now.
No, you're not talking too much. I have no one off the top, so I'm gonna have to think about it. Which doesn't mean there aren't great writers. Yeah.
I mean, everyone should read Lisa's book as a matter of absolute and extreme urgency. And I'm not just saying that because she's in the room with me here.
I'm going to drop the links back in if anyone hasn't got it yet.
So, and obviously, Robin Wall Kimmerer is someone really useful to read in so many ways. When I read that little line that she dropped in that book about, what would it be like to feel that the earth loved you back? I just burst into tears. I'd never even considered that. All these narratives we hear about the natural world, they're all declensionist narratives. They're all about ruin, devastation, and suddenly like, what? J. Drew Lanham's Home Place is astonishing. It's the sort of memoirs, the writings of a Black ornithologist. It's the most lyrical, beautiful book.
That's a wonderful book.
A particular favorite actually is it's very hard to get hold of. It's from a very small press in Britain. It's the journals of the poet R.F. Langley. And he produces these astonishing, they're just diary entries, but they do things like, he'll look at a little springtail insect on a brick wall and suddenly you get this disquisition on Hamlet and the end of the world and, meaning, and you just think, well, that was brave. And he pulls it off every time. It's beautiful. So that's the journals of R.F. Langley, Home Place by J. Drew Lanham, and Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Great.
I can't stay me off for speaking so fast. I'm so sorry. Shall I type them in here while Lisa,
that would be perfect.
Sorry.
I think I'll just shout out a couple of poets because that's really where I get so much of my nature writing, aside from Helen Macdonald's phenomenal work. So Brian Tier is a poet that I write about in the book, who's just sort of offhand comments in a lecture about the myth of the wilderness cathedral kind of changed my life, and that's documented in the book. And Brenda Hillman is another a poet, sort of, and Camille Dungy. So really, any of their work. And I'll shout out the Dow Orion book, which was so important to me. That's also there's part of the penultimate chapter is devoted to her work, but she has a book called Beyond the War on Invasive Species that really kind of just flipped me out. I thought it was so incredible. So she was a restoration ecologist who was kind of rocked by the amount of pesticides and just super intensive violent methods that were being prescribed for getting rid of these invasive species. And she got curious about like, what are the actual impacts here? And, are they performing other sort of, in permaculture world, they call them services. So are they performing other functions that we're overlooking? And, these plants are arriving in context. And there's some really exciting stuff. I mean, it's not a black and white book. It's not just a all out case in favor of invasive species, but surprise, surprise, it turns out these are plants that are arriving in particular contexts, and they often are capable of like remediating profound damage. And, if given enough time, might even just die back on their own and give rise to native plants to succeed them after having kind of prepared the ground. So that's a beautiful book.
So can you say the name of that one more time, Lisa?
Oh, it's Beyond the War on Invasive Species.
Such an important topic. I'm always astounded by how obvious the xenophobia is writing about invasive species. It's like, what functionally is this species doing in an ecosystem? But it's always like, it shouldn't be here, it's foreign. I mean, it really is so blatant. And
just like zero interrogation of, so far, starting.
Yeah. And it's like one of the mainstays for people who want to like care for their local environment. That's the focus of so much work and so much attention, I think, to the deficit of a lot of other things that people could be working on. And
Yes.
I love that you both brought up poetry, because I know both of you have written and published a great deal of poetry. And sometimes the answer is not at all, but I would love to know whether that background has any effect on how you approach nature writing, which is a completely, on the face of it, different form altogether.
You want to take that one, Helen? Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
absolutely. So I'm going to go back to the previous book, to H is for Hawk. You know, I remember laughing about this because writing the exposition really of my own life, my emotional states, the things that were happening to me, that was hard. That was really hard, partly because I'm British and I had to be emotionally open. I'm not very good at that. I had to learn how to do that. But the bits about landscapes and what it was like to be out with a hawk in this kind of parti-colored, ever-moving rural landscape were extremely easy to me because they felt like poetry. And the thing in terms of craft, what poetry has done for me is as I write, I'm always amazed at these people who are like happy to write a whole book and then revise it. I can't do that. I have to write like I write poetry. And what I'll do is I'll chase a sentence down the page and I'll futz with it. And then finally it will snap shut and it will just make the paragraph lock me out, just like a poem does. And that's when I know it's done. So it's kind of like forging a chain of links, writing a longer piece for me, right? Particularly, and the thing about essays that's lovely is I get that sense that they are a little bit like that with that poem length, that it's possible to kind of take a deep breath and almost kind of feel that there's an arc to a essay that's the kind of same feeling as a poem. So yeah, the ways in which that you have to unhook your conscious mind and let the words dance and play in front of you and then know when it's finished, that is very much like writing poetry for me with an essay. But there's a lot more swearing and cigarettes and stuff in the essays than there were in poetry. So yeah, it's a craft thing, I think.
Yeah, I think I swear less in the book maybe than the poems. It's interesting to watch you describe it, Helen, because it's such an embodied description. And I think that's the thing about that, why poetry was such a great training for all other forms. To me anyways, because to me it's music, So some of these movements that you're talking about in composition, kind of, it's like a movement in a symphony or something, or it could be jazz or, any other form. Sometimes it's punk, but yeah. So that kind of sense is sound, or sound is sense.
Listening as you write, listening very carefully.
Yeah. And for me also, I think, to get back to the becoming vulnerable, or to be able to access the emotion so that the reader can too, but without maybe being too on the nose about it. That I think poetry was good training for that too, because you can use the rhythm and the music and the turns to kind of like transgress the brain barrier and get into the blood. And so it's just kind of a way of facilitating feeling, for the reader, or trying to, which probably sounds really,
It's hard to talk about poetry without I worrying about
the beast.
Yeah.
Well, I always find it very interesting when people who have mostly established themselves through poetry move into prose and longer pieces, because you do see that sort of that intensity of language and also that very careful structuring play out in prose quite frequently. And I think that's something that's true in both of your books, where you both you maintain like tone and atmosphere really consistently and persistently, even though it's a longer work, which is all to say that the books are very good, and if you don't have them yet, you should get them.
No, it's like that. It's like, it really does feel like a little bit like reading one of those beautiful long epic poems, the way that you get this kind of sense of a as you say, of a sort of symphonic movement with things coming in and out. It's like the whole Sibelius thing, right? This sort of things emerge and then they sort of sink away. It's great. I'm sorry, I'm just going to be raving about this book forever. Shut up.
Oh man, you know, you actually froze for me, but I just heard you raving, so thank you. Yeah, it's telling me my internet connection is unstable. I'm sorry.
You still look and sound correct. So
okay.
Keep going. I think the other side of the equation here is that in writing like this, I think any project that you take on with writing teaches you far more about that thing than you expect when you start. And I'm wondering, in the process of writing these books, what changed in your perception of the world and your relationship with it, simply because of how you had to look at it to complete these projects?
I mean, I think I have a pretty simple response to that, which is usually, maybe I'll preempt the question that ends up coming. I haven't looked at the chat, so maybe somebody's already asked it, but hope is kind of a slippery term, and it's definitely worth complicating. But I will just say that when I started the book, I really didn't expect to find any answers. It seemed worth a shot to try. And by the end of it, I was actually, rocked by the abundance of possibilities that I encountered. So I think what changed in me was like a fundamental feeling of possibility for sowing life in the destruction, and this idea that we don't have to sit around and wring our hands and wait for the agents of destruction to lay down their swords, because it's certainly worth trying to, stop these mad kings of the CEOs of whatever, like all these horrible corporations who are laying waste to the world and contributing so much carbon to the atmosphere, et cetera. But also, if that's too overwhelming, there's like a lot of land that could use your hands and your good efforts and your love and attention and your sustained, this kind of returning energy in all weathers, over a sustained period of time, that building of intimacy and that kind of call and response relationship that can take a place that's completely desertified and turn it into a garden. And it's not even an exaggeration. That's like within all of our power. So if that's what lights you up, I say go for it. And yeah, that's what changed in me is that kind of hope.
Yeah, absolutely. The hope is such I mean, all those things, and how it's possible to work in a local scale and do good work. It's really, really important. It's so easy to feel powerless, to feel absolutely without any purchase on what's happening. The systems are so vast, so terrifying that notion of kind of it's a total antagonist to any kind of action is really easy to fall into. So yeah, absolutely, that realization. My own little realization, I think, really was, back in the day, I used to teach the history of science, and I taught this series on the two cultures, which is such a joyful thing to teach, not. But it's like, the great division between humanities and the sciences, right? And I increasingly, as I wrote this book, became obsessed with this notion of 16th century, I'm going back all the time, but these 16th century emblematic natural histories, which were these kind of, early kind of guides to animals, which were very, very, again, a bit like the cabinets of curiosity, that they didn't really work according to today's kind of categories at all. Natural philosophers would, you'd write these books and you would have all the information about a creature in the book that was available. And this would be what we today call scientific knowledge or natural philosophical knowledge about the animal's habits and where it lived and what it did and all this kind of stuff. But it would also have all the human knowledge as well. So medical knowledge, kind of like, spiritual stuff, anything kind of, its religious connotations, its folkloric elements. And, increasingly I feel that, there is this great kind of war on scientific expertise, which is terrifying. You know, we need science for the hard numbers, we need it for the stats, we need it to work out what to do next. But there's also a sense that science as authority means that we aren't allowed to look at any of the other ways in which the natural world touches us. So I just had this sort of sense that this notion of an emblematic natural history in which we both, you know, we prize the science, it's really important, but we don't discount the other stuff. We don't discount the emotional, the sort of societal, the kind of other kinds of meanings that landscapes and creatures have, that we look at it all. And that became really important to me writing this book. And I still am very, very fierce about that. We can't afford to just look at anything in just one way anymore.
Yeah, and you demonstrate such incredible range to that effect in the book. I mean, it really feels like, yes, we're saying yes and to all of it.
Yes, and exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much. We have a few minutes for questions.
Oh, yeah.
I already want to say thank you. This has been one of my favorite events that we've had.
Thank you, Alex.
So, and if anybody has questions and hasn't already put them in the Q&A box, feel free to do that. We're just going to see what we can get through. From Christy, we have a question. I hear you both say community and nature are good partners, and I wonder what ways you may see us being able to build pathways to interacting with each other and nature.
I'm going to be a little bit, I'm going to push the boat out a bit here. Is that just English idiom? I don't know.
I like it.
One of the things that I hear a lot is that screens are this terrible barrier between us and the natural world. And yeah, fair enough. I do spend a lot of time faffing around on Twitter. However, the thing that also I'm really delighted at is there's a kind of democratization of natural historical knowledge that's happening through, say, for example, Twitter, right? I keep encountering these moments where people are out in the countryside or they're out in the wild and they see a plant or a fungal, you know, fruiting body and they don't know what it is and they photograph it and they'll send it into Twitter, they'll post it, and suddenly this community of benevolent experts will weigh in and they will, you know, identify it, and then these little tiny strange little communities gather around the joy of learning and teaching and just creating these sort of communities online, and I think this is a really benevolent and delightful thing. You know, this is knowledge that would be hard to get hold of in other contexts, and I have seen those kind of communities build and grow and become really strong. So I just want to say, let's not discount that as an element of goodness in terms of relationship to the natural world.
Yeah. I guess many hands make light work is the thing that comes to me. You know, whether the hands are virtual or, you know, in the same space and touching. I just don't think, I mean, certainly there's a place for the lone person on the landscape, you know, and the kind of figure of the hermit and the, you know, these are totally, like, you know, ways of life that are certainly worth living and to be honored. But also I think that there's kind of a lost history, at least in the States, of, you know, how people live in community sustainably and really have like created what we understand to be the natural world, you know? So these kind of Edenic landscapes in North America, and particularly in the West, that, you know, people were stepping into and viewing as vacant, and marveling at, you know, and appreciating, but not understanding that they were, you know, intensively managed by human communities, and that's really been, you know, the norm for a lot of human history all over the planet. And also, having gone to wilderness survival school, there's like this whole, you know, doomsteading kind of like prepper kind of, you know, worldview where it's like me against not just nature, but me against all other people. And it's just easier to survive in a group. mean, it's very basic, like, many hands make light work. So I guess that's how I would answer that.
Here we go. From Sophie, we have the Wunderkammer and pilgrimage were clearly not disconnected practices in early modern Europe, coupled with the associations of religious devotion in both your titles. Is there a certain nostalgia for non-secular curiosity that runs through your work?
Oof. Yes. I debated whether I should write this as an essay towards the end, which I guess is about the divine, and I'm not I don't have faith. I grew up in a family of hard-bitten journalists. But, as I say in this essay, I spent a lot of time when I was writing H's for Hawk trying to find the right language to talk about certain experiences that I was having in the natural world. And I tried to use philosophical language. I tried to talk about the sublime, this 19th century concept, and it just didn't quite work. And then after I'd finished that book, I realized that I needed to go to kind of, 101 theology books to find the language and the concepts I needed, So there's an essay about the numinous in the natural world and how those moments where, and I think many of us have had those moments in nature where something very small can happen and it can be absolutely transformative. I say, time can stop. Those moments are very, very special, and they can't be looked for. They kind of like grace, they fall upon one. And I think I'm just becoming a lot more chilled about being brave enough to write about that. It's secular, but it's big for me. So that's something I'd love to sort of chase down a little bit more, see where it goes,
Lisa, what do you think?
Huh?
Oh,
I don't think that's for me, is it?
I think it's for both of you, yeah. Both your titles.
Oh, I don't have an answer, but I loved Helen's.
Well, I can certainly say that if you haven't read Believers yet, a lot of it is concerned with these sort of wild and intense spiritualities and pairing that with sort of digging deep into the natural world. So that's definitely sort of a combination that comes up.
Yeah, actually, so one thing I will say is there's obviously, like, for anyone who's read the book, there's a lot about the Christianity and those stories, like the Eden story and all that. So I'm not a religious person either, but one of the really powerful aspects of reporting the book for me was seeing the ways in which people are understanding these stories they've inherited in ways that are actually like, potentially nourishing to the natural world and to their communities, and maybe even offering frameworks for understanding how to survive through this massive transition and this crisis and how to respond to it. So, what Helen was saying earlier about the ways that we kind of talk about nature, these stories that we tell, I kind of like, I'm more interested in sort of the impact than I am in the story itself. Like, what is the outcome of the story that we tell about who we are in relationship to the land?
Mm-hmm. I think ultimately, both of you are writing about something that's deeply important, which is that you can't really hope to preserve or assist or understand or be loved in return by something that you aren't, persistently affectionate towards and obsessive about. So choosing to stand directly in the world and find great meaning in it is something that I think everybody in both of your books does. And I think that is of tremendous value. I also think that we're just about to run out of time. So I just want to say thank you so much to both of you for writing these wonderful books, to both of you for joining us this evening, and to everybody in the audience. who has chosen to be here and to be part of the conversation. This has been really lovely for us, and I hope for you as well.
This was great. Helen, you're amazing. Thank you so much.
It's been wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I'm sorry if any questions weren't answered. Time is a nightmare like this. Thank you, everyone. It's been an absolute joy, and I shall now take myself with a cup of cocoa to bed.
Yeah. All right. Sleep well. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, all of you.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Good night.